If the walls could talk. I imagine you might have heard that phrase before. In this place, if the walls were suddenly given a voice, you would likely hear a lot of talk about phone lines and wrong numbers, this being the old Bell telephone building. But thank heavens, walls can't talk. Can't even think, as far as I can surmise. Now, portraits and pictures, why, they can speak, if you pay attention. And I think you're folks who can. Why, heavens, you've been listening to me for quite a spell. Can't see my lips move? Don't worry. That will be our little secret.
Come, John. These ladies and gentlemen came in here to learn a little something about the history of our town, not your talent as a ventriloquist.
Well, fine. I can do that. The Onondaga Historical Association has kept thousands of pictures that can do a lot of talking. I'll select one.
An automobile? Why that?
Why, the automobile has really shaped American life, and life right here in Onondaga County. Why, from my observations, the automobile has affected the local lifestyle and landscape as much as the old Erie Canal, or our salt industry, or even the railroads. And if we talk about automobiles, I can boast a little about my grandson, but more about that later. My name is John Wilkinson. I lived in Syracuse quite a long time ago, back before it was a city, even before it was a village. 1825 was a special year. The Erie Canal was finally finished, and our growing community became an official village of nearly 1,000 people. I was serving as the local postmaster, and the new village needed a name. I suggested Syracuse, inspired as I was by the classical city in Sicily. In those days, transportation was either on foot or by horse, unless some river or the canal happened to run in the direction you were going. By 1840, the mighty railroads were added to the concoction, and by 1860, Syracuse had street railways, or trolleys as you folks like to call them. Now, I was a railroad man myself, sat on the board of many lines, and served as president of the Syracuse and Utica Railroad.
John, make your point.
I'm getting there. You see, railroads or boat lines or stagecoaches were generally commercial, not individually owned. Except for having a horse, only one's own legs allowed us to go when and where we pleased. That was all to change by 1900. Now, that's where my grandson comes in.
Finally.
And others like him. Others like Henry Ford, Ransom Olds, and those Dodge brothers. These gentlemen were inventing what some people more or less accurately labeled the horseless carriage. Almost no one could imagine the changes that these noisy contraptions would create. Seems one of the very first autos appeared in Syracuse in 1899. A one-cylinder Pioneer made by the Haynes-Apperson Company of Kokomo, Indiana, and proudly driven by Mr. T.O. Wilton. At the turn of the century, lots of people were trying to make it rich building automobiles. In July of 1899, the Syracuse Post-Standard reported on the prospects of one well-known local bicycle manufacturer. E.C. Stearns and Company have in mind the manufacture of automobiles. The company has one under construction at the present time, and providing this one turns out all right, the company will consider seriously the idea of manufacturing horseless carriages. By 1905, there were dozens of entrepreneurs across the nation trying to build a successful automobile. Syracuse developed a few of its own: the Moyer, the Chase, the Century, and even a formidable motorized cycle known as the Nera car. Some used electricity, and some were propelled with steam. But it was the gasoline-powered combustion engine that won out. In 1899, my grandson, John Wilkinson, was designing bicycles for the Syracuse Cycle Company. It was the huge popularity of bicycles in the 1890s that gave rise to a nationwide effort to build a motorized version. Well, anyway, my grandson built his first horseless carriage that year. Eventually, he became partners with a gentleman named Herbert Henry Franklin, or H.H. Franklin as he was known, and for 30 years, right here in Syracuse, Franklin produced America's most successful air-cooled auto. Eventually, most automobile builders lost more money than they made and closed shop, but a few were successful. In 1904, a young man from Michigan named Henry Ford produced almost 1,700 motorized carriages. 10 years later, that had grown to an astonishing 308,000 vehicles a year, thanks to his Model T. Here in Syracuse, Mr. Franklin's car was a true champion. Oh, they weren't as cheap as Mr. Ford's, and so not quite as popular, but the Franklin plant over on South Getty Street was turning out a respectable 9,000 autos a year by 1919, and would later become the largest employer in Syracuse, with 3,200 workers in 1929. Other local industries like Brown Light Chapin and New Process Gear thrived in just making parts for the booming automobile business. By the time of World War I, it didn't matter if it was a Ford, a Franklin, an Oldsmobile, or a Pierce Arrow from Buffalo. The horseless carriage had taken over America like a storm. In 1900, there were only 8,000 automobiles registered in the entire United States. 15 years later, there were over 2 million. And just 5 years after that, in 1920, that had quadrupled to over 8 million autos and more than 1 million trucks chugging along our nation's roads and crowding the streets of its cities and towns. Here in Onondaga County, it was no different. You could find automotive contraptions in Clinton Square downtown, driving along dusty roads in Skaneateles, or delivering goods everywhere. The automobile was taking over. In 1900, when the Automobile Club of Syracuse was founded, it had only 6 members. But during the year of our first local auto show, just 9 years later, over 800 cars were sold. Syracuse policemen were given semaphore devices in 1915 to control the bustling downtown traffic. And in 1922, a new contrivance was unveiled. A new traffic signaling device, which may later be used on a number of corners in the city, was installed at the corner of James and State Streets today by Commissioner of Public Safety James B. Spencer for the purpose of experimenting. It will take the place of the semaphore, and a series of red, green, and amber lights, visible day and night, will direct traffic. The idea was developed by Commissioner Spencer, and the device manufactured by the Krauss-Heinz Company. Syracuse Post-Standard, September 9th, 1922. Believed to be the first traffic light in the world, Syracuse's Krauss-Heinz Company would soon make quite a success of this new device. Why was the auto so popular? Well, of course, the gasoline engine was proving to be more efficient and easier to maintain than a horse. But I believe it was the freedom to control your own travel that made them so successful. Controlling one's own destiny is a particularly strong American trait. By 1920, Onondaga County had over 18,000 cars, one for every 11 residents. This created new enterprises to sell, service, and even store cars. In 1905, Syracuse had just 9 such businesses. By 1915, there were over 60, and by 1925, over 200. The auto was to change people's lives forever, but it also brought a great transformation to our town's landscape. Automobiles required certain modifications, shall we say, to our surroundings. From 1910 to 1920, the addition of an automobile house, or garage, changed the look of America's homes. Some were simple, and some were quite elaborate, looking like miniatures of the main house. Then there were roads. 4 wheels required a smoother, harder surface than the 4 legs of a horse. Good paved roads, especially in rural settings, were very rare at first. By 1910, the growing legion of motorists were forcing states and local municipalities to improve existing roads and to put up directional signs so city folks wouldn't get lost on their jaunts into the countryside. Along the country's rural roads, stone and dust gave way to asphalt. By 1930, the state was filling in its old canals to make even more roads for automobiles. The Erie Canal became Erie Boulevard, and a section of the old Oswego Canal between Syracuse and Liverpool became the Onondaga Lake Parkway. Someone even published postcard views of this new affair, a proud local example of our nation's growing inclination to build modern, landscaped highways exclusively for the use of automobiles and the pleasure of their passengers. With the new roads came thousands of roving motorists and more changes. In the 1920s and 30s, the era of roadside America, a sort of automobile landscape, was born. And it arrived in Onondaga County like everywhere else. Gasoline outlets grew from a single pump planted in front of a simple store to specialized emporiums. Concern over their appearance and a desire to create easy recognition led to great efforts to make them architecturally appealing and distinctive. Specialized buildings to sell autos were developed by the 1920s, boasting large windows to showcase the shiny appeal of the metal machines, like this 1920s home of Chapin Buick on West Onondaga Street. More automobile travelers created a need for overnight lodging that could also accommodate the family auto. Early auto campgrounds developed into cabin courts in the 1920s, and after World War II, a tremendous surge in travel brought with it the more efficient motel. These unique early structures could once be found all over Onondaga County, especially along Route 11, its main north and south thoroughfare, and along Routes 5 and 20, the primary east and west arteries. They are rare today. The superhighways, like Route 81 and the New York State Thruway, now have their familiar descendants near most of their exits. Another distinct change the auto brought to the countryside was their marriage to the motion picture. Starting in New Jersey in 1933, enterprising folks began offering motion pictures in the comfort and privacy of your own automobile. Drive-ins became the rage by the 1950s, and Onondaga County had its share. The North, DeWitt, Salina, and Lake Shore were all popular, but would eventually lose out to what would become America's other great infatuation, television. Today, Onondaga County has lost all of its drive-ins. One human need, easy turtle. The automobile requires fuel to run, and people need to eat. So, as their motorized carriages penetrated the countryside, convenient roadside eateries soon appeared. These so-called drive-in restaurants offered easy access and sometimes waitress service right to your car. The 1920s saw the start of A&W drive-ins, White Castle, and White Tower hamburger stands, and a Texas-based chain called the Pig Stand, so named for its famous pork sandwich. There was a pig stand on East Tennessee Street in DeWitt. A Howard Johnson's was built nearby in the 1940s, and others followed. The idea was to serve food conveniently and quickly so you could be on your way. Today, you call this a fast food restaurant. Even a simple hot dog stand in Liverpool gussied itself up in 1939 to compete for more of this automobile drive-up business. The owner, Mr. Valentine Hyde, was greatly influenced by his visit to the 1939 New York World's Fair, where the vision of the future was often focused on the auto. He chose a metal exterior, streamlined design, and bright colors to attract traffic from nearby Onondaga Lake Parkway. The number of these roadside establishments exploded in the 1950s and 60s, right along with the number of autos and suburbs being built. Their designs needed to be bright, distinctive, and consistent, easily recognized from a fast-moving car. Carol's Hamburgers, eventually headquartered right here in Onondaga County, opened in Syracuse's Valley Plaza in 1962. And our first McDonald's arrived on Erie Boulevard in 1965. Why, today, our community's roadside landscape seems to be a permanent reflection of your hurry-up, fast-paced lifestyle. You might say the drive-thru is a symbol of how the automobile has become a central feature of America's culture.
Excuse me. I'd say there's another symbol that's even more appropriate. The shopping mall.
Who's speaking? Oh, Mr. Chappell. I remember your fine department stores well. Been listening in on my little presentation?
Of course I'm listening. You're always interesting, John, if a bit long-winded.
Well then, let's move along. What was your point? Oh, yes, the shopping mall. Well, perhaps you're right. Malls seem to have replaced our old Main Street shopping districts, and the automobile had a lot to do with that. After the autos started becoming popular, it didn't take long for businessmen to realize that almost any retail exchange could benefit from that drive-up and park-easy and free convenience.
You know, long before World War II, cities like Syracuse had been growing and expanding their downtown shopping districts. By the 1920s, downtown Syracuse offered a wondrous array of hundreds of retail stores and services, and they could be reached from surrounding neighborhoods and outlying villages by a reasonably efficient public trolley or interurban transit system. That's why I built my store there.
Yes, but once Henry Ford got the price of that Model T of his down to only $350 in 1917, almost everyone could afford their own private transportation, and they began to use it. 19th century downtown streets had been built with a few carriages, streetcars, and mainly pedestrians in mind. By the 1920s, hundreds of mass-produced automobiles began to fill those streets. Car accidents became a real problem. And just where do you put all the cars when people want to get out and shop? For the next 25 years, planners struggled to build parking lots and more streets downtown. Why, filling in both the old Oswego and Erie canals to make automobile boulevards in the 1920s was viewed as great progress. Most of Clinton Square was turned into a parking lot.
Syracuse had another problem. Lots of railroad tracks along its downtown streets. Many automobiles suffered greatly in their encounters with a rumbling 150-ton locomotive. That was one of the reasons why Syracuse went to great lengths by 1936 to elevate the railroads out of the streets.
Well, Mr. Chappell, back in the 1840s, we didn't know this would become a problem. Now that Great Depression of the 1930s sidetracked the steady growth of the automobile industry. Many auto manufacturers closed shop during those hard times. Mr. H. Franklin's proud company went bankrupt in 1934. Those that survived found themselves building jeeps, tanks, or trucks for World War II. The end of the war in 1945 brought great prosperity. Automobile production soared in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Car registration in Onondaga County almost doubled, and downtown Syracuse continued a seemingly losing battle to accommodate everyone's automobiles. The real answer lay in the relatively open land just outside the city's edges. Why, one could buy some old farmland along a main road like Route 5's East Genesee Street or Route 11's path toward Cicero, build a set of stores, and have plenty of land left over for a big parking area. Put a lot of stores together, and you had what was called a shopping plaza. In Onondaga County, the idea became reality in 1949 when Westvale Plaza opened in Geddes, and again in 1954 when 14 stores called Shopping Town opened in DeWitt, followed by Northern Lights in 1955 and Fairmount Fair in 1959. Given better roads like the Thruway in the 1950s and Route 81 in the 60s, people used their autos to flee older, congested residential areas. Developers built thousands of homes in these new suburbs, all dependent on the trusty automobile to commute. People liked the freedom, the open spaces, the newness of everything. But time at home and with the family and neighbors had to compete with time traveling to and from places in the car. Once those shopping plazas began to sprout up in the suburbs, downtown Syracuse's days as the traditional shopping hub were numbered. Fortunately, your friends at the Onondaga Historical Association have preserved thousands of old pictures, so you can look into the past anytime you want.
I must say, Mr. Chappell and Mr. Wilkinson, that I've learned quite a bit listening to these old and not-so-old pictures talk.
The automobile has brought great convenience and freedom and opportunity for all of you. But like many inventions over time, it has dramatically changed our surroundings and our lives. Things once treasured are gone forever. But history teaches us that change is inevitable. So my challenge to you is to recognize that some links to our past must be maintained. They'll give you valuable insights into who you are and where you're going. Now, I wonder if old Joshua Foreman is hanging around here somewhere. Maybe he'd like to discuss just how Onondaga Lake started to change from a beautiful fishing spot into... Well, I remember back in 1821, I was standing on the shore, looking out over the beautiful spot.